I'm author Bob Pearson. Welcome again to the studio. Today we're going to talk about inspiration and ideas for the characters that'll be in your books, people. In other videos, we've already talked about places and things, and you can find those also online. But today we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts, the gel that holds your book together, the characters that will be talking to one another, the dialogue and so forth, which we'll later cover in other videos. But for now, where do we get the ideas for all the people that we need to put into any given storyline? My books typically have dozens of characters in them. My latest, One Kill Hunting Lilith, I've lost count how many characters are in that one. They basically break down to a few different categories. The main characters in this particular book, Jack Walsh, his assistant David Wharton, Lilith herself, and the FBI agent who is hunting her. There are some supporting characters that recur frequently throughout the course of the story, and then a raft of secondary peripheral characters that just kind of make the story fit together and flow along. They may only appear in one chapter. They may only appear in one paragraph in some cases. It's a reality in writing. Biblical scholars talk about a particular story in the New Testament about a rich man and a beggar. And the beggar is named by name. And because of that, scholars say that it's a true story. Now that's a basic in writing. When you identify a character by name, then it becomes real. They become more than just scenery, or talking scenery, if you will. They become a real person and an integral part of the storyline. So what you want to do is go out into the world whenever you go out, going to work, going shopping, wherever you go, whatever you do, and just be observant. Keep your eyes open. Every face has some kind of a backstory. You may not know what it is, and you're probably going to make up your own anyway. So look at faces, look at mannerisms, look at the way people do the things they do. Listen to dialects and listen to accents. My characters come from all over the world. Some of them from the South, where they speak English, of course, but it has its own dialect. Some from Russia, some from Ireland, from England, from France, and other places where there are different dialects. And although we're going to write in English, we may want to pepper the story with a few translated words that kind of fit into the conversation. And we'll do that with Russian quite a bit. But we'll talk more about doing that sort of thing when we start talking about fleshing out characters and doing dialogue in another video. In the book Project 16, there's a character in here who's a Jamaican hacker. She was inspired by a waitress that my wife and I saw while we were at Chili's restaurant. She wasn't our waitress. She was dealing with the tables on the other side of the dining room, but we were sitting nearby the door to the kitchen, and so I was able to observe her frequently walking back and forth and serving these tables. I could hear her conversation with the customers and get a real good sense of her mannerisms and the way she spoke and so forth. And that became the model for Sinead, who gets her big close-up, if you will, in this particular book. But she also shows up in small pieces, small little sections of other books. And so it's a character that I've kind of leaned back on from time to time. And it all started with that waitress. David Wharton, the slobby conspiracy theorist character who first appears in Pieces, but also appears in Lilith. He got started off in my mind anyway, as far as a character, from a character I saw on the sidewalk, just walking along in St. Albans. This, wearing a faded black and stained t-shirt, much smaller than the rolls of his body should have allowed anyway. Stringy hair, scruffy beard. This person was the perfect image of what David Wharton should be. And it was, every time I describe him in either book, I'm describing this guy that I saw on the sidewalk. That's what this is all about, to put an image in your mind, and every time you talk about that particular character, that's the image that makes him real while you're writing it. Genevieve O'Neill, the Princess of Erin, the Bon Renard, if you will, makes her big stage premiere in the book about her, Ascension. This is in fact the woman who inspired the image of the character. She was a car salesperson at a dealership where my wife and I were in the process of buying a car. The salesperson who was helping us was going up talking to his manager, which you know he's not doing, and preparing mountains of paperwork for us to sign and leaving us pretty much to ourselves, sitting in front of his desk in the showroom. And a couple of desks over was this red-headed woman in a black leather jacket who, when I saw her, I thought, that's her. That's the princess. That is the image of what I want to use in this book. And so I went over and I talked to her, and that is how she ended up on the cover, on the back cover, and throughout the book as various illustrations. We did a photo shoot with her, and she was great. She was great. We'll talk more about doing live photo shoots and hiring models and stuff in another video. But that was the image that, as I wrote the book, as with the others and so many others that I don't have time to mention right now, those are the images of the actual characters in the book that I envision as I write. It all harkens back to when I very first got started. I invented the character of Moses Jones. He appears in the first book that I published, and I needed some sort of a visual, at least in my memory banks, to lean on. And Michael Clark Duncan, the now deceased, sadly, black actor, big guy, sweet disposition, but you don't want to mess with him. He became the model for Moses Jones, who appears in various roles throughout almost all of my books. And so I still, to this day, keep Duncan's image in my mind as I write about Moses Jones. It's just been perennial, and it's worked so well that I use the same technique with all of these other characters. Something to put in your toolbox as you go into your writing. There's an author named Ransom Riggs. You may or may not have heard of him. He wrote a book called Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. And there's an interview with him on his DVD for the movie of the same title, where he talks about where he gets the idea for his various characters. My wife bought this book. This is the first one. He's written a couple of sequels since. She bought this in a brick and mortar bookstore. Yes, there are still a few around. Because the cover image really impressed her. Well, apparently that's what impressed the author too. He had a hobby, and he says all about this in his interview, of buying old photographs in antique shops and flea markets and places like that. You know, things like this. This is a picture of a small child. I don't know, looks to be 4 years old, maybe 3 years old, something like that, posed as they did back in the day. This picture is probably at least 100 years old, maybe more. And he would take these photographs and he would conjure up a backstory for the character. This person, obviously he has no idea who they are, and I don't know who this kid is. It doesn't even have a name written on it. And considering how old the photograph is, probably long since passed on. So what did this child do with its life? Well, that's the backstory that I can write and use in one of my books. I picked up a couple of others too. This guy reminded me, with the mustache and the haircut and even the clothes he was wearing, of Jesse James. He does kind of have that look, doesn't he? Yeah, he might have been a very respectable kind of guy, maybe a real estate agent or a bank teller or bank president or something, but he also has that outlaw look to him. And that's, well, you never know. You know, again, it's wherever my imagination may take me. And this guy, I don't know if you can see him, it's a pretty dark picture. This guy looks like the cat who ate the canary. Let me get that a little closer. Yeah, there you go. You can see him a little better there. He's got that smirk on his face like, you know, he just got away with something. He kind of looks like a gangster from back in the 20s and 30s, dressed in a three-piece suit. He's got his watch chain and on his vest, and the hat. I mean, it's all about the hat. But you'll notice on a lot of these, back in the day when you went to a photography studio, you paid for a picture. The cost was not so much in the photography, but it was in the print that you walked out the door with. So on the back side of a lot of these, including the other two that I just showed you, is the name of the photography studio and maybe a little information about where they're located and so forth. And because these are so old, there's an address on here, but there's no phone number. There were no phones back in that day. Now we'll talk about using these photos in your books in another video, because there are some copyright issues about actually using them. But as far as using them for inspiration for your characters, there's a gold mine in boxes in antique stores and flea markets and stuff. I paid $2 for two of these, and the gangster looking guy who's in kind of a matted thing, he cost $4 because he came in that little nifty holder. Now there's a danger in using people you know as characters, even relatives that you think, oh, Auntie what's her name loves me so much, she won't mind if I use her as Ma Barker or something like that. Yeah, she might mind. All I could say to that, and that question has come up in some of the seminars that we've done in the past, ask permission. It's always best to be honest and upfront. Even if you use somebody as an inspiration that is so obvious when you write the book that people who know this person couldn't help to identify him as that, your character as them. And the same goes for anybody that you know personally, like co-workers and stuff like that. Be inspired by these people. You can draw from what you know of their personalities and the way they do things, their mannerisms and so forth. But don't write so obviously that somebody could figure out that, hey, you know, that's me in the book. Unless, of course, you ask first and they give you permission. There's also a catch-22 with that, because before the book gets published, you really don't want to let anybody read it for their approval. That's a train wreck and a roller coaster that you do not want to, or maybe combination thereof, that you do not want to entertain. This is an art, and it is your creation, not up to the not up to the approval of anybody else. Now, of course, when you go big time, you get a real publisher, and the publisher has an editor, and they go through all of that. Well, that's a different story. That's when it becomes kind of a somewhere where you're standing on one side that's art and the other side that's commerce, and they will need to sell books, and they're going to tell you what they need in the book to make it saleable, and you want to be true to your muse. So some compromise will have to take place, but while you're still an independent author and you're still self-published, you call the shots, and don't let anybody else have the opportunity to do that for you. While you're working on these various characters, now if you're writing fiction, of course, you're making up all these characters from scratch, and hence the need for all of this inspiration and people watching and observing and being on all the time, as I say. You really do need to define each of these characters. Now what I do is I write up a synopsis. It's not much. It's just a couple of lines about each character and the spellings of their names, especially if it's something a little unusual. I just want to make sure that as I go along, I spell their names correctly from the beginning to the end of the book. In a previous video, you saw my studio and you saw the monitor, my computer, rimmed with Post-it notes. Those are the names of all of my various characters in a particular project, so that I can make quick reference to them as I go along. I also, because I have spell check on this computer, I also program that spelling with the capitalization into the computer, so that it will check for that as we go along. Now, something else that is something to consider, especially when you have so many characters. Now, I mentioned earlier in this video about names. If you name a character, you give a character a name, you make them real. And that means you need names. A lot of them. In my case, it may be dozens for a particular book. This is from the last book that I just did. Between Post-it notes and little scraps of paper where something has come to mind and I've just scribbled it down and brought it home and kept it handy here, to legitimate pages of notes of various, listings of all kinds of people's names. That's what went into this last couple of books. Where do we get these names? Well, sometimes I kind of go with a theme. Sometimes I watch old TV shows and I watch the credits. And some of the names that come up on the credits, some of them are kind of interesting and some of them are kind of unusual. And I'll jot those down, use those. The trap that you want to avoid, and it's so easy to fall into, is reusing the same names over and over and over again. If you have like 4 guys named John in one book, that gets pretty seriously confusing. And if you start using that same pattern in subsequent books as well, it gets to be boring, frankly. So you need a fresh batch of names all the time. A lot of my characters are international, so I look online for, good example. I needed some Russian names when I was writing Project 16. I needed about a dozen Russian names. And so what I did was I went online and found the list of all the members of the Russian Duma. That's kind of their parliament, if you will, a government body. And just mixed and matched first names and last names that I thought sounded good together. Didn't use any of them as is. I mean, that's important. Just kind of mix and match a good first name with a good last name, and there's your character name. And make sure you write it down so you don't forget, and cross it off the list so that you don't accidentally use it again later, because you may forget that, hey, that was a good idea. Hey, that's a good idea. Again, wait a minute. as we get older, that sort of thing happens a lot. So have to take certain precautions to avoid that. So naming all your characters, and sometimes I get a whole bunch of names, like a list like that. I'll use a bunch of them for a particular project, but then I'll bank that list someplace. I have folders in my file cabinet full of that sort of thing. We'll take a look at that in another video too, when we talk about doing research and stuff. That's kind of what gives it that third dimension. These are real people, at least as people read the stories. That's the impression they get. Remember, the only limitation in any of this is your own imagination. And be willing to take a few chances. Don't do anything illegal or anything, but, you think something sounds a little weird. Well, if it's not really weird, maybe give it a shot. And remember, you're going to go through numerous drafts. You can always do a search and replace if you decide, oh, I don't like that after all. So the takeaway here is be observant. Bank your ideas. Look at everything and everyone in your world, wherever you go and whatever you do. And all of this will be fodder for your next story. Now, if you're working with fiction, you need to create this whole world of your own. So you need all of these elements: people, places, things, plot, story, etc., etc. We've covered some of that already. We'll cover things like storyline and story arc and developing characters and all of that sort of thing in later videos. But for now, these are the foundations. This is the nuts and bolts to get things started. So until next time, I'm Bob Pierce from the studio.